People often believe that old age means weakness. They believe wrinkles mean silence. They believe loneliness means surrender. But sometimes the quietest people are the most dangerous ones. This is not just a story. This is a warning. Her name was Margaret Wilson. She was 74 years old. She lived alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood in the United States. Her house was old. The paint was peeling, the porch light flickered every night, and no one ever noticed if the light was on or off. Margaret had been a widow for 8 years. Her husband passed away quietly in his sleep. No drama, no last words, just silence. Her only son lived in another state. Busy job, busy life. Phone calls turned into messages, messages turned into holidays only, and holidays slowly disappeared. At her age, she didn't fear death. She feared being forgotten. Every morning, Margaret woke up at 6 a.m. She made herself a cup of weak coffee. She watered her plants slowly. She waved at neighbors who never waved back. Every evening, she sat by her window, watching people walk their dogs, laugh with friends, live their lives. She was invisible. Across the street lived Karen Thompson. Karen was loud. Karen was confident. Karen always believed she was right. She watched Margaret like a hawk, every movement, every mistake. To Karen, Margaret wasn't a person. She was a problem. One afternoon, Margaret's trash bin stood a little too close to the sidewalk. Karen stormed out of her house. "Some people should not live alone," Karen said loudly, making sure others could hear. Margaret picked up the bin silently and moved it back. She said nothing, but she remembered everything. At the neighborhood meeting, Karen stood up confidently. "We need to talk about Margaret," she said. The room went silent. "She forgets things," Karen continued. "She's old, she's slow, she lowers our property value." Some people laughed. Margaret felt her hands shaking, but she stayed quiet. Margaret looked down at her hands, hands that once signed contracts, hands that once controlled millions of dollars, hands that once built careers. No one knew, and she wasn't ready to tell them. Not yet. That night, Margaret sat alone in her living room. She opened an old drawer. Inside were documents, property files, legal notes. She smiled softly. "They think I am weak," she whispered. "That is their mistake." Outside, Karen laughed with neighbors. Inside, Margaret began planning, slowly, silently, because revenge, when served patiently, is always sweeter. Margaret was not always this quiet woman. There was a time when people listened every time she spoke, a time when rooms went silent when she entered. But that life was buried under years of loneliness. 35 years ago, Margaret worked in corporate compliance, contracts, property laws, neighborhood regulations. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She destroyed people with paperwork. Legally, silently. Old age did not weaken her mind, it sharpened it. Margaret remembered every rule, every clause, every mistake people made when they became arrogant. And Karen Thompson was arrogant. The next week, Karen placed a complaint. Margaret received a letter. Violation notice, it read, improper lawn length. Margaret smiled, because the grass was exactly within regulation. Karen had made her first mistake. Margaret began walking slowly around the neighborhood, not to socialize, to observe. Illegal fences, unapproved extensions, parking violations. She wrote everything down, patiently. Karen laughed loudly one afternoon. "She won't even understand the notice," she told neighbors. Margaret waved politely. Inside her pocket was a notebook, full. That night, Margaret opened her laptop. The HOA website loaded slowly. Rules appeared. She whispered softly, "Thank you for underestimating me." The weeks that followed were no longer quiet. Something had changed in the neighborhood. Not in Margaret, but in the way people looked at her. Karen Thompson became louder. She spoke with confidence, with arrogance, as if the neighborhood already belonged to her. Every conversation somehow returned to one topic: Margaret. "She's getting worse," Karen whispered loudly on purpose. "She doesn't even understand the rules anymore." People listened. Some believed her, some stayed silent. Silence helped Karen. At the next neighborhood meeting, Karen stood up again. "This has gone too far," she said. "We can't keep pretending everything is fine." Margaret sat in the corner, hands folded, eyes down. Karen continued. "She forgets rules. She's slow. She's confused." Then she smiled. "Our property values are at risk." A few people nodded. Margaret felt her chest tighten, but she did not speak. Inside her mind, Margaret was calm. She wasn't listening to insults. She was counting. Words, faces, reactions. Humiliation had stopped hurting. It had become information. That evening, a paper was taped to Margaret's front door. Final warning. Violation of HOA standards. Possible eviction review. Margaret stared at it for a long moment. Then she slowly removed it. She did not cry. She did not panic. She walked inside and locked the door, because fear was exactly what Karen wanted, and Margaret was done giving her that. Margaret sat at her desk. She opened her notebook. Dates, names, rules violated. Karen Thompson appeared on every page, neatly. Margaret whispered softly, "They think I'm cornered." She smiled. But corners are where plans begin. Outside, Karen celebrated. Inside, Margaret prepared. Karen had just made her second mistake, and this one would cost her everything. After the final warning, the neighborhood went quiet. Not peaceful, careful. People watched Margaret from behind curtains, waiting for her to break. She didn't. Margaret's mornings changed. She still woke up early, still made her coffee, but now, after watering her plants, she walked. Slowly, deliberately, not as an old woman, as an observer. She carried her notebook everywhere. If a fence crossed property lines, she wrote it down. If a car blocked a fire lane, she noted the time. If a renovation lacked approval, she took a photo. No emotion, only facts. Karen noticed the walks. She laughed. "She's probably lost," Karen told a neighbor. "She doesn't even know what she's doing." Karen never noticed the camera in Margaret's hand. She never noticed the notes. Late at night, Margaret sat at her desk. Her laptop glowed softly. She downloaded HOA bylaws, city zoning rules, county property codes. Her fingers moved with confidence. Muscle memory returned. One rule led to another. One violation connected to 5 more. Margaret mapped everything. Karen's house stood out. Extensions without permits, illegal fencing, noise complaints ignored. The evidence was overwhelming. Margaret did not act. She waited, because rushing was for the careless, and Karen was careless. One afternoon, Karen hosted a loud backyard party. Cars blocked driveways, music blasted past curfew. Margaret watched quietly. She wrote down every single detail. That night, Margaret organized everything, printed documents, photos, timelines. She labeled the folder HOA Compliance Review. Her name was on the cover. Margaret stood by her window. She watched Karen laugh under bright lights. Margaret whispered, "Tomorrow." The trap was set. All that remained was patience, because the most powerful revenge does not scream. It waits. The next morning, Margaret woke up calm. No anger, no fear, just clarity. Because today, she would stop reacting and start acting. She placed the thick folder inside a plain envelope. No threats, no notes, only facts. She wrote one name on the front, the HOA office. Margaret walked slowly into the HOA building. She greeted the receptionist with a gentle smile. "I'd like to submit a compliance review," she said. The receptionist nodded. No one questioned her. Inside the folder were photos, dates, times, clear violations, not assumptions, proof. Margaret had done this before, many times. That afternoon, Karen watered her lawn, laughing, unaware. She believed she was untouchable. That belief was about to collapse. 3 days later, Karen opened her mailbox. A formal notice, HOA compliance review. Her smile disappeared. "This is ridiculous," Karen said loudly. She probably made it up. But the letter was detailed, too detailed. A second letter arrived, then a third, each one worse than the last. Fines, deadlines, inspections. Karen's confidence began to crack. Karen stormed to Margaret's house. "You did this," she shouted. Margaret opened the door calmly. "I followed the rules," Margaret replied. Nothing more. Karen had shouted. Margaret had whispered. And yet, Margaret held the power, because truth doesn't need volume. Neighbors began talking. Karen avoided eye contact. Margaret walked peacefully. The roles had begun to reverse. That night, Margaret slept soundly, for the first time in years, because revenge had begun, and it was legal. The notices did not stop. They multiplied. Each letter Karen received felt heavier than the last. Deadlines, inspections, consequences. The rules she once ignored were now standing in front of her. Karen tried to laugh it off. She told neighbors, "This is nothing, just paperwork." But at night, she couldn't sleep. She reread the letters again and again. The words did not change. An inspector arrived one quiet morning. He walked around Karen's house, measured fences, took photos, wrote notes. Karen followed him, talking nonstop. The inspector did not respond. Facts did not need conversation. The report was clear. Multiple violations, years old, ignored. Fines were issued. Corrections demanded. Karen's hands shook as she read the report. Karen went door to door, asking for help, for signatures, for sympathy. But the neighbors remembered. They remembered her laughter, her insults, her confidence. Most doors stayed closed. People began greeting Margaret. Small nods, quiet smiles, nothing dramatic. But respect was returning. Margaret noticed. She said nothing. One afternoon, Karen lost control. She shouted at a neighbor, blamed the HOA, blamed Margaret. Her voice echoed through the street. Margaret closed her window. Silence was still her weapon. A certified letter arrived. Failure to comply would lead to legal action. Karen sat at her kitchen table for hours, staring. The reality finally settled in. Margaret watered her plants, the same way she always had, slowly, carefully. Chaos surrounded her, but she remained untouched. Karen finally understood. This was not an accident. This was not bad luck. This was consequence. The trap had tightened. There was no escape, only accountability. And Margaret was just getting started. By now, everyone knew something was wrong. Karen's house was no longer perfect. Inspectors came, letters arrived, whispers spread. The truth was slowly finding its way out. A special HOA meeting was announced, mandatory attendance. The agenda was clear: compliance violations, community conduct, accountability. Karen read the notice twice. Her stomach dropped. The meeting room filled quickly. Neighbors sat quietly. No laughter, no gossip. Margaret entered last. She chose a seat in the back. Calm, unbothered. Karen's name was called. She stood up slowly. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the smile. She tried to explain. The words came out rushed, defensive. The HOA officer spoke calmly. Photos appeared on the screen. Illegal extensions, unapproved fencing, repeated noise violations. Dates, times. The room stayed silent. Karen tried to interrupt, but the officer raised a hand. "These are documented facts," he said, "not opinions." Karen sat down, her face pale. Then the officer continued. Additionally, there are multiple complaints regarding harassment. The room shifted. People looked around. Names were mentioned. Margaret's was one of them. All eyes turned toward Margaret. She stood up slowly. Not angry, not emotional, just honest. "I followed the rules," Margaret said. "I stayed quiet." But silence should not be mistaken for weakness. Her voice was steady. The room listened. People finally understood. This was not revenge. This was correction. This was accountability. And it had been earned. Karen looked around. No one defended her. No one laughed. For the first time, she was alone. The truth was out. The roles were reversed. And Margaret had not raised her voice once. The meeting ended without applause. No celebration. No shouting. Just silence. The kind of silence that follows truth. Karen was fined heavily. She was ordered to remove illegal structures. Her violations were officially recorded. Her reputation was damaged. Not by gossip, by facts. The neighborhood changed. People became careful with their words. Kinder. More aware. Respect slowly returned to the streets. One evening, Karen stood at Margaret's door. No confidence, no anger, just regret. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Margaret listened. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply nodded. "I never wanted revenge," Margaret said. "I wanted respect." Karen lowered her head. That was enough. Days passed. Margaret returned to her routine. Morning coffee, watering plants. But now, neighbors waved back. Margaret sat by her window, watching life again. But this time, she felt included, seen, valued. Old age is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. And kindness should never be mistaken for inability. Never underestimate someone who stays quiet. Because sometimes, silence is preparation. Margaret turned off the light. The porch was quiet, but her presence was finally acknowledged. And that was victory.